In this video, we're going to look at a new tool in ZBrush 2020. It's under the Polygrouping menu, and it's Polygroup from Polypaint and Polygroup from Masking. So here we've got this alien character where I've created some sort of tribal tattoo markings using the Deco brush. What I'll do is I will come here to From Polypaint, and I'm going to turn the slider, the tolerance up, so I get more polygroups based on my Polypaint. So I click From Polypaint, and that's going to start polygrouping based on the underlying polypaint. So we'll give it some time to think about that. Because we have these large sweeping blocks of indigo, that should polygroup separately as a selection that we can then isolate. There we go. If we go into frame mode here, you can see we get quite a few groups now, but if I Control-Shift-Click, I can isolate just those bits there. Now, I want to further refine this, so I'm going to hold down the Alt key and I'm going to click From Polypaint again. There we go. You see that further refines those polygroups, so I can hide the pinks and all the others here, all these other groups, or I can just make everyone visible again and then just isolate those. So it's still just a little bit, no, actually I think we mostly got it. No, I think we could do a little bit more because we've got these little hanging bits here that we don't want. So Alt-click From Polypaint, and then that further refines things. Let's Control-Shift-Click on that polygroup again. There we go. Now if we look here, turn off frame mode, some of the purples here are quite close to that indigo, so it's causing us to catch extra groups there, which I'm not really keen on. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use, under Polypaint, Adjust Colors. And I'm going to do a little selection here just for these bits here, and I will make this color very, very, very divergent from the underlying purples and greens. Let's just make that super crazy saturated and intense. Click OK. There we go. Now that should polygroup with far more clarity compared to the other portions. Let's go ahead and clear our mask and go back to polygroup. And let's set our poly tolerance, let's set that to 0.5 and go into frame mode and do From Polypaint. There we go. I'll Control-Shift-Click on these bits here, and now we get a much nicer selection. Now I could further refine this and keep adding polygroups. If I hold down the Alt key when I click From Polypaint, what that will do is it will additively change the polygroup, so I can continue to refine that down. But we hit a nice point here. So what I can do with this is I can mask this, make everything visible again, and then I could use that masking here to make an extraction. So let's go to Subtool, Extract. We've set our thickness to 0.005. Let's go ahead and click Extract. And we should be able to create an extraction based upon those tribal markings. I like those, so we'll click Accept. There we go. Now I'd like to clean up the edges of them, so what I'll do is I'll go to the Deformation menu, go to Polish by Features and turn this on, and then just turn that slider up, and you see what that does is it just cleans up all the little nuances and weirdness maybe. We can also do Polish by Groups. Again, we'll turn that on. That just makes it a stronger effect, and we can polish by polygrouping. Let's make these metal. Go to RGB, color, excuse me, let's change this to white. Go to mRGB, color, fill object. Go back to our subtools and turn on visibility on that head. So then we get these interesting kind of metallic accoutrements that line up right against the character that are based on those underlying polypaint elements. Now I can also do this with masking. Let's go ahead and select the head again and hide those pieces. Sometimes masking can be a little bit easier, especially if we don't want to do any sort of color hue shifting. Like if I wanted to keep that indigo, like so, if it was very important to me not to change that color, what I would do in this case is I would go to the Masking menu. Under Masking, I would go to Mask by Color and then Mask by Polypaint. And this opens up a similar control to what I had before when I was adjusting color. I'll just click and drag and select the indigo. If I invert the mask, You can see that it's sitting right perfectly on top of that of those markings. So I'm just going to go ahead and click OK, and then that gives me a mask on those markings. So if I go to Polypaint and turn off Colorize, you can actually see. Let's go back to our basic material 2. You can see where those masks sit. So now I can go to Polygroup, and I will just group by masking. Now it's set to 0.0001. I will go ahead and set this to 0.5, and then from masking. And there we go. If we go into frame mode, you can see we get a very, very clean polygrouping based exactly where we had that masking. So those are two very, very powerful tools that are available to us in ZBrush 2020. If I were to, for example, mask these out, I could then take my inflate brush, turn down my Z intensity, and just sort of add a real interesting kind of raised scarification to this. So there's all sorts of interesting things that we can do here. I could also use, for example, let's raise all of this and then smooth all of that. I could then use maybe the surface controls. If I go to Tool and open up Surface Noise and then edit our noise, we could add noise just to these scarification areas. So let's say, for example, I turn up the strength of the noise, adjust the scale of it. I could go into my noise plug and go to my trusted Veroni. I quite like the look of Veroni. We'll turn Mix Basic Noise down and turn our noise scale, or excuse me, our plugin scale down. Turn our strength up, and then click OK, and then we can get this very, very interesting Veroni scaling texture all over that, that scarification area. So that's another potential use for this tool. So hopefully you found this useful. That is under the polygrouping menu that is new in ZBrush 2020, and that is polygrouping from Polypaint and from masking.